So far, we've built an application that shows all of the departments in a database, but I want to reach a point where a user can see the employees that are in each department and also edit and add new employees to a department. And I think the best way to do that would be to turn each of these list items into a link that a user can click on, and that will go to a department detail page that shows the department name and all of the employees that are in that department. This means I'll need to modify the index view a bit. Let's open up the index view for the home controller. And now, instead of displaying just a list item, what I want to do is build an anchor tag here. Essentially, what I want to do is build an anchor tag that goes to some URL that can display the details about a department. And it might not make sense to build an action that is something like /home/department detail. In other words, a department detail method on the home controller. It might make more sense to actually have a department controller that has a detail action, and then I also pass in the ID of the department that I want the details about. That fits in really well with the default ASP.NET MVC routing because it can just pick apart this is the controller, this is the action, this is the identifier. There's a couple different ways I could do this. I could just hard code the anchor tag here like I've done, but I can also use some features in ASP.NET MVC known as HTML helpers. HTML helpers allow you to build little snippets of HTML, and they take away some of the hard things that you might have to otherwise do in the HTML. All the HTML helpers come off of an HTML property that's available in a Razor view, and HTML helpers include things like action links and checkboxes and drop-down list, things that build little pieces of HTML. I want an action link. That is a link that points to a specific controller action. The text to display in that anchor link is the first parameter, and the text that I want to display is still the department name. Then I can specify the action that I want to call. I want to call the detail action. I can specify the controller. I want it to be the department controller. And then I can specify something known as route values. Route values allow you to pass additional parameters through this link via the query string. In other words, I need to get the ID of this particular department into that department detail action so it knows what department to pull up. And I can do that by creating a new anonymous object and saying department ID. Essentially, that will create a C# object for me that has an ID property that is set to the ID value of this department. And then I also need to pass in an HTML attributes parameter, which I don't need any special attributes on this anchor tag, so I will just pass in a null. And hit Control F5 to actually run the application just to see if we got some links out here. We should know by now that if I click on a link, it's going to throw an error because we do not have a department controller here yet. But I can see the link. I can see in Chrome status bar that it points to /department/detail/1. The human resources department is /4. All of this looks correct. I just now need something that will respond to this particular request. So let's flip over back into Visual Studio, and this calls for a new controller. One way I can add a controller is to right-click and say Add Controller, and I have all sorts of options here when it comes to scaffolding. I can scaffold out an empty controller, so I can say that I want a department controller, and let's just start an empty controller and I'll do everything from there. I can scaffold out a controller that already has read and write actions available to me so that I can edit data and it validates data and it knows how to do all that with the entity framework. That's another option, and that's something you can explore. I'm just going to start with an empty controller and build this up from scratch. The department controller has to derive from controller. That all looks good. We do not have an index action for departments. That's not the action we need. We need a detail action or a details action. Over here we called it detail. So this one will be singular to detail. When someone invokes this action, we need to get an ID parameter. And when it comes to parameters in the MVC framework, the MVC framework will do everything in its power to try to retrieve this parameter value for you. If you have something called ID, it will look in the route to see if it appeared somewhere in the URL. It will look in the query string, And during a form post, it will also look in posted form values to see if it can find an ID somewhere. But given an ID, then we need to look it up in the database. And the easiest ways to do this is to define a constructor with our department data source again. We'll call that DB. We'll bring in the namespace emanager.domain. I should be able to use ReSharper, which is a plugin I have installed in Visual Studio, to automatically create a private field for me to store that incoming value. And that's my database. It's available and ready to use. My model now will be the single department that has that ID. So I can write a link query against the database and say something like db.departments. Give me the single department where the department ID equals this incoming ID value. And that's the department that I want a detail on. That's my model. I can hand it off to a view. Now we just need to create the view. So let's add a view called detail, going to be strongly typed against a department. I'll scaffold out a details view using a layout page. Let me add that and change around the markup a little bit. So this will be department detail, where it displays the department name. We'll have a label and also display the department name. And then there's some additional action links here to edit a department. That might be something we want to add in the future, the ability to edit a department name or other attributes on it, see a list of all the departments. I don't necessarily need those for this application. What I do want to do is show a list of all the employees that are in a department. We don't have any in the database yet, but hopefully we will soon. Let me create a table. And that table can have a header row where we show the employee name. Also have a column for links for that employee so that I can edit that employee. And then we need a series of rows for each employee in the model.employees collection. Remember, we added that collection to a department. When I hit that property, the entity framework will be able to query the database and bring in all the employees for me. And I just need to write them all out. So for each employee, we'll write out a table row that has a cell that shows the employee name. And then a little bit later, we'll come in and fill in some additional links to edit that employee. Let me just save and build and see if this works. Hit Control F5 to run it in the browser. Hopefully we will see still our list of departments, and I'll be able to click on a department. It won't have any employees yet, but I should be able to see that this is the Human Resources Department. And there it is, Department Detail, Name Human Resources. We could certainly fix that UI up a little bit. But for now, we'll go with it. And what we've learned in this section is that there are things known as HTML helpers. We used one in the index view to build an action link. In the detail view, there's also HTML helpers to help display information. You give this an expression that shows what property on the model that you want, and it will look at that property, at its type, at metadata about that type, and figure out the best way to display that particular property. If you want to see how to influence the behavior of things like display for, look in my MVC3 videos for templates and data annotations.